She asked the same question over and over until Karoline had enough. What happened next stunned the entire room. The room was packed. A row of cameras lined the back wall, their lenses trained on the podium where Karoline Leavitt stood, poised and confident. She was no stranger to tough crowds, but today felt different. The air in the Washington, D.C. briefing room was thick with anticipation, an unspoken tension humming beneath the surface. She adjusted the microphone. "Good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started." Immediately, hands shot up across the room. Journalists hungry for a headline, eager to get their questions in first. Karoline pointed toward a familiar face, a reporter from a major network, who asked about the administration's latest policy on tax cuts. She answered smoothly, delivering the kind of well-rehearsed response that came with the job. Then, another question. A follow-up on education reform. Karoline addressed it without hesitation. She had done this countless times before: stand firm, control the message, and navigate the press like a seasoned professional. But that's when it happened. A voice cut through the room, sharper than the rest. "Ms. Leavitt, let's talk about the real issue here." It was her, the liberal reporter. Karoline knew her well, always aggressive, always looking to push the conversation into controversy. She was seated near the front, leaning forward with a smirk, her pen tapping rhythmically against her notepad. Karoline stayed composed. "Go ahead." The reporter didn't waste a second. "Do you think the administration's policies are intentionally designed to suppress certain communities? Because the data suggests—" Karoline held up a hand. "I've answered that question before. The administration is focused on policies that benefit all Americans, regardless of background. If you'd like to discuss the specifics of today's topic, I'm happy to continue." A few murmurs rippled through the room, but the reporter wasn't done. She leaned in further. "You didn't actually answer the question, though. Can you directly address whether—" "I did answer," Karoline interrupted, her tone firm but controlled. She glanced at the other journalists, signaling that she was ready to move on. For a moment the room seemed to settle. A brief pause, as if everything might return to normal. But then, "I just don't see why you're avoiding it," the reporter pressed, her voice cutting through the space. "It's a simple yes or no. Are these policies suppressing marginalized groups?" The temperature in the room shifted. Other reporters exchanged glances. Some looked intrigued, others uncomfortable. No one liked a press conference turning into a showdown. But that's exactly what was happening. Karoline exhaled slowly. "I'm not avoiding anything. I'm staying on topic. If you have a question related to today's discussion, I'll gladly answer. If not, I'll be moving on." But the reporter wasn't backing down. She leaned even closer to the microphone. "So that's a no comment." The energy in the room tightened, the weight of the moment settling on everyone's shoulders. It was clear. This wasn't just a press conference anymore, it was becoming a spectacle. A hush fell over the room. No one spoke, but the silence wasn't empty. It was loaded, the kind of silence that wasn't passive but waiting, like an elastic band stretched just before it snapped. Karoline adjusted her stance, placing both hands on the podium. "I've answered your question. I'll be moving on now." She pointed to another journalist in the back. But before they could speak, the same voice cut through again. "Why is it so hard for you to give a straight answer?" A flicker of irritation crossed Karoline's face. Not much, just a brief tightening around the eyes, but enough for those paying attention to catch it. She wasn't new to this. She knew reporters had a job to do. But there was a difference between pressing for accountability and turning an event into a personal stage. And right now, it was clear which one this was. A few cameras panned from Karoline to the reporter, catching every shift in body language, every subtle movement that could be spun into a headline. Karoline inhaled through her nose. "I don't believe in wasting anyone's time. If you have a new question, I'll answer it. Otherwise, I'd like to give others a chance." The reporter smirked. "Sure. New question. Why is this administration so afraid of transparency?" A few quiet gasps. Some reporters scribbled furiously. Sensing the moment turning into something bigger, Karoline gave a measured blink, the only sign that the remark had landed. Her grip on the podium tightened for a second before she let go, exhaling just slightly. She smiled, but not the warm diplomatic kind. This was a different kind of smile, one that said, "I see exactly what you're trying to do." She took her time before responding. "Transparency? That's exactly what this administration stands for. But what you're doing isn't about transparency, it's about theatrics." The words hung in the air. The reporter's smirk faltered just a little. Another journalist, this one seated closer to the back, cleared his throat. "Karoline, if I could—" But again the same voice interrupted. "So you're dismissing valid concerns as theatrics? The American people deserve real answers." The cameras caught everything. The slight tilt of Karoline's head. The way the other journalists shifted in their seats, some clearly frustrated that the event had been hijacked. A veteran journalist, someone who had been covering politics for decades, leaned back and muttered to a colleague, "This isn't journalism, this is performance art." But the reporter didn't care. She knew exactly what she was doing. The longer she kept this going, the more likely it was to go viral. A confrontation like this? It was gold for social media. Karoline saw it too. She had a choice. Engage and give the moment more fuel, or shut it down entirely. She sighed, finally looking toward security at the side of the room. She didn't have to say anything. The shift in her gaze was enough. The room tensed again. Everyone knew what that meant. This was no longer just an argument, it was about to escalate. The air in the room felt heavier now. No one was speaking, but the tension was thick enough to hold everyone in place. Karoline could see it, the way some of the journalists avoided eye contact, others gripping their pens just a little tighter. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. The reporter, a woman in her mid-30s with sharp eyes and an unwavering posture, didn't move. She was still leaning forward, pen resting against her notepad, a quiet smirk playing at the corner of her mouth. She wasn't here to ask a question, she was here to make a point. Karoline straightened. "I'll say this one more time. If you have a relevant question, I will answer it. But I'm not going to stand here and engage in bad faith arguments." The reporter chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Bad faith? Karoline, I'm doing my job. Isn't that what a free press is for?" Karoline didn't blink. A free press is about holding people accountable. What you're doing is trying to turn this into a spectacle. A few murmurs rippled through the room. Some of the journalists stole quick glances at each other, sensing the shift. The back and forth was no longer about policy. It was something else now. The reporter tapped her pen once on the table. "So, just to be clear," Karoline knew what was coming before she even said it. "Are you refusing to answer because you can't? Or because you don't want to?" Silence. A few reporters inhaled sharply, bracing for what came next. Karoline exhaled, measuring her response. "I am refusing to play a game. This press conference is not about you." The smirk on the reporter's face flickered, just for a moment. Then she leaned back in her seat, arms crossed. "Right. Because expecting transparency is a game." This time it wasn't just a murmur. A few journalists whispered to each other. Others glanced toward Karoline, waiting to see how she would handle this. Karoline had dealt with difficult reporters before. But this was something different. This wasn't about policy. It was about control, about who could steer the conversation. She adjusted the microphone slightly, taking a step back from the podium. "I think we're done here." The words sent a shockwave through the room. The reporter's eyebrows lifted. "Excuse me?" Karoline didn't flinch. "You've made it clear you're not interested in an actual discussion. You're looking for a headline. If you'd like to stay and listen to the rest of the press conference, you're welcome to. But I won't be answering any more of your questions." The reporter let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "So, silencing the press. Got it." Karoline's jaw tightened. She knew that was coming. She knew exactly how this would be spun the second the cameras went off, but she also knew there was no winning with someone like this. She glanced toward security. A subtle, wordless signal. And just like that, everything changed. People shifted in their seats. The energy in the room snapped from tense anticipation to full-blown confrontation. It was no longer just an argument, it was about to become something much bigger. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Journalists weren't just watching now, they were recording every second, every movement, waiting to see how far this would go. The hum of camera shutters clicking filled the space, capturing the exact moment Karoline glanced at security. The reporter noticed it too. Her smirk disappeared. "You're seriously doing this?" she asked, her voice lower now but sharp enough to slice through the room. Karoline didn't answer. A uniformed officer stationed by the door took a slow step forward. He didn't need to say anything. The meaning was clear. The reporter had two options: de-escalate or double down. She chose the latter. "This is unbelievable," she muttered, shaking her head. Then louder, so the cameras would catch it. "So much for freedom of the press, huh?" Karoline remained still. Freedom of the press doesn't mean hijacking a press conference. The reporter let out a dry laugh, looking around the room as if inviting the other journalists to agree with her. Some shifted uncomfortably. A few scribbled notes. But no one spoke. The security officer took another step. For a split second, the reporter hesitated. She could stand her ground, make them physically remove her. That would be a viral moment. Or she could get up, walk out on her own terms, and control the narrative another way. Karoline watched as the decision played out behind the reporter's eyes. Then, slowly, the woman reached for her notepad. She stood, adjusting the strap of her bag. "This is a disgrace," she muttered under her breath, just loud enough to be picked up by the mics. Then one final jab before she turned toward the exit. "You can kick me out, but you can't silence the truth." Karoline didn't respond. The door closed behind the reporter, and just like that, it was over. Or at least it should have been. The silence that followed was thick. No one sure what to do next. The cameras were still rolling. Some journalists kept their eyes down, pretending to scribble notes. Others just stared. Then, from the back of the room, a voice. "Karoline, do you think this was the right decision?" She turned her gaze toward the journalist who had spoken. "I think it was necessary." Another voice. "You don't think this will backfire?" She knew it would. She knew by the time she left this room the internet would already be flooded with clips. She could already see the headlines. "Karoline Leavitt removes reporter for asking tough questions." Did it matter? She straightened. "We're here to have discussions, not disruptions. If anyone else has real questions, I'm happy to answer them." A beat of hesitation. Then slowly a hand went up. The press conference continued. But the real storm, it was just beginning. Within minutes, the footage would spread like wildfire, and by the time Karoline left the podium, her name would already be trending. By the time Karoline stepped off the podium, her phone was already buzzing. Staff members hovered near the edge of the room, whispering in hushed tones, their faces tense as they glanced between their screens and the door the reporter had walked out of minutes ago. She didn't need to check her notifications to know what was happening. The clip was spreading, fast. As she walked down the hallway toward her office, one of her aides caught up with her, phone in hand. "It's already trending. Hashtag silencing the press is picking up steam." Karoline exhaled through her nose. "Of course it is." The aide hesitated. "The major outlets are running with it. Some headlines are fair, just reporting what happened, but others." She trailed off, scrolling. "Leavitt shuts down press freedom. Reporter escorted out for speaking truth to power." Karoline stopped walking. "Speaking truth," she repeated, half a laugh, half a scoff. She wasn't speaking truth, she was performing. The aide nodded. "Doesn't matter. That's not how it's being framed." Karoline had known this was coming the second she locked eyes with security. The way these moments played out was almost predictable now. Clip the tension, cut out the context, slap on a dramatic headline, and let the outrage machine take care of the rest. Still, as frustrating as it was, she wasn't about to panic. She had been in politics long enough to know that narratives could shift. "What about our base?" she asked, pushing open the door to her office. The aide followed her in. "They're backing you. Conservative commentators are calling it a win, saying you handled it with professionalism. The usual names are defending you." Karoline nodded. "And the White House? They're distancing themselves, but they're not condemning you. Yet." That last part hung in the air. Karoline leaned against her desk, arms crossed. And her? The aide didn't have to ask who she meant. She scrolled again, eyes flicking over her screen. "She's leaning into it. Already did a live interview calling it a Chilling moment for press freedom. She glanced up. She's getting booked on every major network. Of course she was. Karoline tilted her head back, staring at the ceiling for a brief second before pushing off the desk. She wanted this, she muttered, and we just gave it to her. The aide bit her lip. So, what's the play here? Karoline didn't answer right away. She walked to the window, looking down at the street below. Reporters were already gathering outside waiting for her next move. She knew she had a choice: stay quiet and let the moment run its course, or get ahead of it before the narrative hardened. Her jaw tightened. The fight wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. The noise outside was growing. Reporters huddled on the sidewalk, cameras angled toward the entrance, waiting for a statement. Inside, Karoline was still, hands resting on her desk as her aide scrolled through an endless stream of headlines. "They're split," the aide said finally. "Some are calling it justified, saying you handled an unprofessional disruption the way any press secretary should. Others—" She hesitated, then sighed. "They're painting it as an attack on democracy." Karoline smirked, shaking her head. "An attack on democracy," she repeated. "For removing a reporter who refused to follow the rules." Her aide didn't respond. They both knew the truth didn't matter, not in the fast-moving world of digital outrage. A second aide stepped in, holding up his phone. "She just posted her full statement." Karoline took a deep breath. "Let's hear it." He read from the screen. "Today I was removed from a press conference for doing my job, asking tough questions. This administration claims to value transparency, but when faced with real scrutiny, they silence the press. This should alarm every American who believes in accountability and free speech." Karoline let out a short laugh. "And let me guess, no mention of how she disrupted the entire event." The aide shook his head. "Nope. Just playing the victim. Of course, it was all so predictable. The selective editing, the carefully framed posts, the dramatic claims of suppression." Karoline had seen this game played before, and now she had a choice. Her first instinct was to go on offense, to call a press briefing, lay out exactly what had happened, and remind the public that removing a disruptive journalist was not the same as silencing the press. But she knew how that would play out. The moment she engaged, the cycle would keep spinning. She turned back to the window. Outside, a news van pulled up, another reporter stepping out with a microphone in hand. The coverage wasn't slowing down. She tapped her fingers against the desk. "What's our strongest play?" The first aide hesitated. "We could release the full, unedited footage before her version gets too much traction. Let people see for themselves how many times you warned her before security stepped in." The second aide nodded. "That way it doesn't look like a defensive move. Just transparency." Karoline considered it. It was a smart move. Let the facts speak for themselves. But she also knew that facts alone didn't win battles. Perception did. Her eyes flicked back to her phone where notifications kept rolling in. She could already predict the cable news segments, the outraged panel discussions, the op-eds dissecting her decision. A long breath in, a slow exhale. Then she nodded. "Release the full footage." The aides moved quickly, drafting a statement, queuing up the video. Karoline watched them work, her mind already 10 steps ahead. The reporter had wanted a spectacle. But what she didn't realize was that Karoline wasn't just reacting, she was setting the stage for what came next. The full, unedited footage went live within the hour. No flashy edits, no dramatic commentary, just a simple post with the raw exchange, letting people see exactly what had happened. The title was clear and direct: "Watch for yourself." The full exchange between Karoline Leavitt and reporter at today's press conference. Karoline sat back in her chair, watching as the numbers ticked upward. Thousands of views in minutes, comments flooding in, some furious, some supportive. Her phone buzzed. A message from a close ally in the media. "Smart move. This takes the wind out of their sails." But she knew it wasn't that simple. The spin was already in motion. The reporter herself had gone on multiple networks, retelling the story in a way that painted herself as the victim. Karoline clicked on one of the interviews. There she was, seated in a dimly lit studio, brows furrowed in righteous indignation. "I was simply doing my job," she told the anchor. "I was asking tough but necessary questions, and instead of addressing them, I was removed." That should worry everyone, regardless of political affiliation. The anchor nodded solemnly. "Did you feel threatened?" Karoline rolled her eyes. "Threatened?" The reporter's sigh was almost theatrical. "Not physically, no, but professionally? Absolutely. This is an attack on journalism itself." The interview cut to a panel of experts, all weighing in on what this really meant. Dangerous precedent. A disturbing moment for free speech. She was just doing what journalists are supposed to do. Karoline exhaled sharply, locking her phone screen. The facts were out there, but that didn't mean people would accept them. Her aide peeked into the office. "You're going to want to see this." Karoline followed her to the hallway where staff had gathered around a TV tuned to a conservative network. The host was playing the full clip, the one Karoline had released, pausing at key moments. "She interrupts over and over," he said, shaking his head. "This wasn't journalism, this was grandstanding." The panelists nodded in agreement. "This was a setup," one of them said. "She knew exactly what she was doing. Push until she gets removed, then play the victim." The host turned back to the camera. "Here's the reality. Karoline Leavitt didn't shut down the press. She shut down an activist posing as a journalist." Karoline crossed her arms, watching as the conversation played out. The split was clear. On one side, conservative voices praising her for standing her ground. On the other, mainstream outlets painting her as an authoritarian figure silencing the press. Her aide glanced at her. "This is going to be a long week." Karoline nodded. "Yeah, but at least now the truth is out there." The question was, who would believe it? The story refused to die. For days it dominated headlines, talk shows, and social media debates. Political commentators dissected every second of the exchange, each side twisting the narrative to fit their agenda. Memes flooded the internet, some mocking the reporter, others portraying Karoline as a villain silencing free speech. But in the midst of all the noise, one thing became clear. The country was split. Karoline knew better than to expect a universal win. That wasn't how these battles worked, but as she sat in her office watching a clip of the latest panel discussion, something struck her. A veteran journalist, one she actually respected, leaned forward in his chair and sighed. "We have to be honest," he said. This wasn't a journalist seeking the truth. This was someone looking for a viral moment, and they got it. The other panelists shifted uncomfortably. They weren't used to hearing this kind of honesty. She asked a question, got an answer. Didn't like it. Kept pushing, not for clarity, but for conflict. And the moment she got removed, she ran straight to the cameras claiming victimhood. "That's not reporting, that's activism." The host frowned. "So you're saying Karoline was justified?" The journalist shrugged. "I'm saying we need to be honest about what journalism is supposed to be. We're here to inform the public, not manufacture outrage." Karoline exhaled slowly. Finally someone had said it. But she knew the damage was already done. The headlines had been written. The clips had been edited. The people who wanted to believe she was suppressing free speech weren't going to change their minds. And the people who supported her had already moved on, waiting for the next political battle. Her aide knocked softly on the door, stepping inside. "You have an interview request from—" "No," Karoline said immediately. The aide blinked. "You don't even know who it's from." "I don't care," Karoline said, standing up. "I'm not playing into this any further. The facts are out. Let them do what they want with them." The aide hesitated, then nodded. "Understood." Karoline grabbed her phone, scrolling through the endless notifications. The storm would pass. It always did. But she knew this wasn't just about one press conference. It was about something bigger. The way the media operated now. The way narratives were crafted. The way truth was becoming secondary to clicks and outrage. She looked back at her aide. "Release one last statement." "What do you want it to say?" Karoline thought for a moment, then smiled. "Just 4 words." The aide waited. Karoline nodded. "Watch the full video." Because at the end of the day, that was all that mattered. The truth. Whether people wanted to see it or not. Media integrity is a fragile thing. In an era where clicks matter more than context, the line between journalism and activism is blurrier than ever. The real question isn't whether Karoline was right or wrong. It's whether we as a society value truth enough to recognize when we're being manipulated. What do you think? Let's hear it in the comments below. And if you want more content like this, hit that subscribe button.